We ended our last video talking about how the late 19th century is caught in this tension between the more traditional European approach to poetry with set forms, sonnets, ballads, basically the inheritance of the Renaissance, the way poetry had been written at least from the 1300s onward. And on the second hand, this new, challenging, democratic, free approach to poetry championed by people like Whitman. Now, we've mentioned Emerson a couple times, and I think it's important to bring him in here to say Whitman wasn't alone and wasn't really the first writer in American history to say, what if we totally ignore what's going on in Europe? What if we push away European forms? Ralph Waldo Emerson had been saying this since the 1830s and really championing this idea of self-reliance. Not just, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and, make something of yourself in this new America. No, there was this idea that there would be a national aesthetic self-reliance where America would stop paying attention to. And if it did attend to the aesthetic traditions of Europe, it would be a negative attention. It would be I see what you're doing, and I'm going to fight against that. I'm going to intentionally not do that. And so Emerson's writings were really influential on Walt Whitman in particular. Emerson was also influential on people like Emma Lazarus, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and others. But Longfellow and Lazarus retained this desire, like, we're going to write sonnets, we're going to write epics, we're going to write in iambic pentameter, dactylic hexameter. Whitman begins to change this, and as we saw in the Whitman poems we looked at in the last couple of videos, and in poetry like Stephen Crane's, we begin to get this freer, less encumbered by the metrics and the rhyme schemes of Europe that emerges in poetry. But it's really in the early 20th century where this free approach, what will come to be called the modernist approach, begins to be the dominant approach that poets write in. And it's in the 19-teens that this really gets up and going. One of the first important poems in free verse in the 20th century was published in Poetry Magazine. And Poetry Magazine is going to come up a few times in this video because Poetry Magazine, which was started in 1911 by Harriet Monroe, Poetry Magazine was founded in Chicago to highlight and be a forum for the new poetry that was emerging. I mean, it published lots of good poets, some formal, some not, but it especially became important as a place that welcomed and published poetry in the more Whitmanian tradition and that eschewed and pushed against the older European Romantic Victorian traditions. The first important poem that comes out in Poetry Magazine in this vein is a poem by a poet we haven't really talked about on this channel before, named Carl Sandburg. Now, Carl Sandburg was a Chicago native. He was someone who grew up reading poetry, who admired people like Walt Whitman and others. And he writes this poem, Chicago, that becomes famous both for its free approach to form and its very different approach to poetic language. Here it is. Chicago. Hog butcher for the world, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and the nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling, city of the big shoulders. They tell me you are wicked, and I believe them, for I have seen your painted women under the gas lamps luring the farm boys, and they tell me you are crooked, and I answer, yes, it is true, I have seen the gunmen kill and go free to kill again. And they tell me you are brutal, and my reply is, on the faces of women and children, I have seen the marks of wanton hunger. And having answered so, I turn once more to those who sneer at this, my city, and I give them back the sneer and say to them, come and show me another city with lifted head, singing so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning, flinging magnetic curses amid the toil of piling job on job. Here is a tall, bold slugger, set vivid against the little soft cities. Fierce as a dog with tongue lapping for action, cunning as a savage pitted against the wilderness, bareheaded, shoveling, wrecking, planning, building, breaking, rebuilding, under the smoke, dust all over his mouth, laughing with white teeth, under the terrible burden of destiny, laughing as a young man laughs, laughing even as an ignorant fighter laughs, who has never lost a battle, bragging and laughing that under his wrists is the pulse, and under his ribs the heart of the people, laughing the stormy, husky, brawling laughter of youth, half naked, sweating, proud to be hog butcher, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads, and freight handler to the nation. This poem is published in 1914 in Poetry Magazine, and you can see that it delves into the seedier aspects, the demi-monde, as it were, of Chicago. He's talking about prostitutes. He's talking about gangsters and criminals. He's talking about, even when it's not crime, the sort of the working class. And people saw this as a celebration of the working class. The focus isn't, your beautiful gardens and your exquisite buildings. It's the railroads, the freight, the stacker of wheat, the tool maker. These are the common jobs that Chicago is known for, both in America and around the world. Chicago is the place of the working man. And Sandburg captures this image of the working man. And he has this image of the boxer, right? Laughing as an ignorant fighter laughs, who has never lost a battle. There's this kind of Gilded Age feel to this, the American city can never be beaten, but it's the Gilded Age not from the halls of power with, the cognac and the cigars and the fancy suits. These are the guys who work for those guys. These are the guys who, make minimum wage, slaving away, hauling boxes and working on assembly lines. This is the working man's America, and this is the poetry of that. You can see, though, that there are some traditional things going on poetry-wise. If you look at it, especially if you listen to it, you can see there's a lot of alliteration, there's a lot of internal rhyme. But there's also this kind of chiastic structure where we start off with toolmaker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and the nation's freight handler in the second and third lines. And then in the very end, we have hog butcher, toolmaker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads, and freight handler to the nation. It's kind of this refrain that sandwiches everything else going on in it. So it has this poetic structure that reminds us maybe a little bit of even something like a ballad with a repeating refrain. But the lines are long lines, except when they're short. The bareheaded, shuffling, wrecking, planning, those are one-word lines, which are caught in between these much longer lines. So there's this sense of rhythm, there's this sense of speeding up and expansion, and then contraction when we want to focus in our attention on the activities that are going on. And so Sandburg really took Whitman's form and played with a little bit, figuring out what are the dimensions and what are the possibilities within it. Sandburg also has another approach to poetry that is a little bit different, that he was working on at the same time as Chicago. And this is a much more sparse and spare approach to language, which would be another dimension of modernism. So this poem is called Fog. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches, and then moves on. It's a short, extended metaphor of a poem. The fog is a cat, or it's like a cat. It has the feet of a cat, at the very least. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches, and then moves on. It's the movement of the fog across Chicago. It feels like a haiku. Now, one of the things that is interesting to track, and there are whole books written on this, and you could look into it if you'd like, is this influence of Chinese and Japanese poetry on the American poetry of the early 20th century. And we know that Chinese and Japanese poetry was starting to be read, starting to be translated in both England and then America in the late 1800s in a way that it had never been before. Part of this is because Japan was politically closed off to the West and then opened up as a new sort of imperial policy in the late 19th century. And so the shorter, more image-focused, less rhyme and meter-focused poetry of Japan started to be very influential, and we can see this in fog. Another poet that is worth looking at when it comes to this focus on the short, small, condensed poem focusing on one or two images is a poet named Adelaide Crapsey. Now, Adelaide Crapsey died in 1914, and a lot of her poetry was published posthumously in 1915. And she worked in a very similar style to Sandburg's more spare style in Fog. So this poem is called Triad by Adelaide Crapsey. These be three silent things, the falling snow, the hour before the dawn, the mouth of one just dead. We have these three discrete images: snow, hour before the dawn, the mouth of one just dead. And they're put into this 5-line poem that has 2 syllables in the first line, 4 in the second, 6 in the third, 8 syllables in the fourth line, and then back to 2 in the fifth. This is a poetic form called the sing-cane, which Crapsey kind of championed in the early 20th century. And it came to be seen as a form that, even though it has rules, it's a form that is more suited for something like the image-focused, Japanese-inspired poetry that the modernists were starting to write. Modernism gets rolling pretty quickly in the mid-19 teens, and it can be difficult to see, okay, who's publishing when and where. 1915 in particular is important because just a year after Chicago appears in Poetry Magazine, another poem appears in Poetry Magazine by a new poet named Thomas Stearns Eliot, or T.S. Eliot. And this is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which begins with the very famous lines, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table." We have a little bit of a lilting, kind of Victorian sounding opening lines. "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky." We have I and sky. It starts and it feels like, oh, this is going to be a pleasant love poem. But then we have this third line that sounds a little bit more like Adelaide Crapsey, like a patient etherized upon a table. Whoa, now we're in kind of a medical, almost kind of ominous, creepy scene. It reminds me of "The Mouth of One Just Dead" from Crapsey's poem of the same year. Death, patience, the medical suspension of life. These are themes that are beginning to be in poetry in a way that was seen as not quite what was done, and the older generations of poets became worried about this new modernist poetry. It doesn't have the same form as the old style. Eliot and Prufrock seem to be kind of mocking an old style, a more Victorian or romantic tradition of poetry, with setting us up to expect kind of lush and proper romance and then giving us something more icky and ominous. Also, this moving away from metrics in favor of two things: the image and just counting syllables as a formal structure. It seemed too spare and too sparse. Another poet around this time who is encouraging people like T.S. Eliot and even facilitating the publication of Eliot is a guy named Ezra Pound. Now, Ezra Pound, like Eliot, was born and bred in America, but also like Eliot, he had moved to England and spent time in Paris in the teens to be part of the art scene. And in fact, Harriet Monroe, who ran Poetry Magazine in Chicago, had hired Ezra Pound to go out and be this international kind of talent scout to find the poets writing in English who were spread across the globe and send their new avant-garde poetry to Harriet Monroe, so she could publish it in Chicago in Poetry Magazine. So in one sense, modernism is very American and local. It's happening in Chicago, but they're publishing poets who don't even live in America, even if they're from America. Not all of the poetry of this new emerging modernism was in these new and radical forms, though. There's a poet who is hanging out in England, who's from New England, who begins publishing poetry right around the same time, who makes a name for himself as someone who's going to use a more democratic language, but not get rid of the old forms. And this is a poet who may be the most famous poet of the 20th century, Robert Frost. Now, Robert Frost is an interesting character because he's giving us a poetry that's at once just as morally complicated and just as interested in the negative experiences of life as people like Eliot and Pound and others, but he's giving it to us in a language and in a rhythm, maybe even we would say in a song, that feels a little bit more palatable. This is the 1916 sonnet, The Oven Bird, by Robert Frost. There is a singer everyone has heard, loud, a midsummer and midwood bird, who makes the solid tree trunk sound again. He says that leaves are old, and that for flowers, midsummer is to spring, as 1 to 10. He says the early petal fall is past, when pear and cherry bloom went down in showers, on sunny days a moment overcast, and comes that other fall, we name the fall. He says the highway dust is over all. The bird would cease, and be as other birds, but that he knows in singing not to sing. The question that he frames in all but words is what to make of a diminished thing. This poem, in one sense, feels like it could have been published in 1850 or even 1750 with a little bit of diction changes. There is a singer everyone has heard, loud a midsummer and midwood bird, who makes the solid tree trunks sound again. Oh, there's a singing bird in the trees. It's so nice. He makes the woods resound. Frost shows that he is the equal of someone like Keats or Tennyson in his ability to find a way to use a line of iambic pentameter in a way that you've never quite heard those words before, even though all the words are words you know. On sunny days, a moment overcast, and comes that other fall, we name the fall. He's playing with this word fall, making us think about, okay, what is the fallenness of fall? He says the highway dust is over all. I like that phrase, highway dust. I think in the 1800s, highway dust, that would be just dirt roads. Carts are going down them. Horses. When we get in the 20th century, in the 16s, highway, it starts to sound a little bit more paved, automobile-like. Now, automobiles in 1916 were not as ubiquitous as they are now. But we start to get an American diction and a vision of the American scene in a way that begins to show the possibilities for a poetry that's interested in a 20th century America and putting 20th century American concerns, hog butcher, stacker of wheat, the highway dust. These are phrases that outside of poetry are totally understandable, but they're beginning to be used by American poets within poetry in a way that elevates them and does to them what poetry can do to language. Now, what is that poetry can do to language? I think the modernists are interested in expanding and exploring that question. Were they too allergic to the past? Were they too allergic to the Victorian sentiment and the way the Romantics would have said it, or the people in the Renaissance would have said it or formed it or structured it? Maybe. Not always Frost, but certainly Eliot and Pound and Sandburg could be accused of ruining poetry. Some people talk about this. When you start playing with form, when you're a master of form, you can find new forms. But if a generation of students grow up on Pound and Eliot and Sandburg and Crapsey, are they going to become feeble inheritors or just non-inheritors of the pre-modern sensibility, of the pre-modern forms and practices and structures. There's an argument to be made that that's true. I want to look at one more poet before we go, who, in the modernist moment, once it's been going for a while, meditates on the nature of poetry. This is, I think, an under-recognized poet. Within poetry circles, people have heard of her, but I think she's often seen as one of the more deep-cut modernists. This is Marianne Moore. In 1921, Marianne Moore published a poem called Poetry, and I'm just going to read it to you. I, too, dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must. These things are important not because a high-sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, the same thing may be said for all of us, that we do not admire what we cannot understand. The bat holding on upside down, or in quest of something to eat, elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a roll, a tireless wolf under a tree, the immovable critic twitching his skin like a horse that feels a flea, the baseball fan, the statistician. Nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. All these phenomena are important. One must make a distinction, however. When dragged into prominence by half-poets, the result is not poetry, nor till the poets among us can be literalists of the imagination, above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them, shall we have it. In the meantime, if you demand on the one hand the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is on the other hand genuine, you are interested in poetry. Now, Marianne Moore is not everyone's cup of tea. T.S. Eliot isn't everyone's cup of tea. But Marianne Moore, I think you can hear in this, is pushing language in poetry to be not just conversational, but almost like an academic meditation on the nature of poetry, the limits of poetry. Yet in the middle, she gives all these very natural descriptions. Marianne Moore became really influential on later poets who wanted to give really detailed descriptions of animals. This becomes a big trend. She was especially influential on the mid-20th century poet Elizabeth Bishop. But how is this poetry? How is this even like Frost? It's published 5 years after The Ovenbird, but it's a totally different register. It's even different than Whitman or Sandburg. At least Whitman and Sandburg are kind of extolling their subjects. She's just, literalists of the imagination, imaginary gardens with real toads in them. What's going on in this? Well, a poetic structure that Marianne Moore is playing with is a structure where she matches each line of each stanza in syllable count to the corresponding line in every other stanza. So the first line of each of these stanzas is the same length as every other first line. The second line is the same length as every second line. But she's intentionally not giving us what Frost is giving us in having, 10 syllables per line, but it's iambic pentameter and it's rhyming. No rhyming. The lines aren't even the same length in each stanza, just compared within the stanza. But across the poem, you have a very strict syllabic pattern. And this syllabic pattern allows her to have these very weird kind of interruptions in the middle of sentences at line breaks. Right? One discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. It is a word that is often put at the beginning of lines. It, after all, a place for the genuine. That's the third line of the first stanza. It, in the meantime, if you demand on the one hand, is the second line of the last stanza. She's having fun unexpectedly breaking sentences and phrases in the middle of them. It can be irritating. It can make it hard to understand. And yet, I think she wants it to feel a little bit like a puzzle. I think Marianne Moore delighted in making her language feel not poetic, but then placed into a structure where it forced it to be organized, even very mathematically organized, to the point of feeling schematic in an unlovely way. Why? Well, like I said, the modernists are trying to push the boundaries of what can poetic language be? What can poetic structure be? And how is it going to help us live life? After all, the bigger context of the teens is World War I, is a lot of things that we thought were stable in Europe are crumbling. In America, we're trying to figure out, what do we do with that? There's a lot more to be said about modernism, but hopefully this has helped you see that things really do change in the first couple decades of the 20th century in American poetry, and Americans are leading the way. Even if you look at England or Europe, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot in particular, these poets are dominant figures who are influencing a lot of people outside of their linguistic traditions. Where was poetry to go after this? What do you do when the new standard is a getting rid of all the old standards? If free verse, or a much more free approach to verse at least, becomes the status quo, what do you do after that? Well, that was a question for the poets of the mid-20th century, and we'll look at them next.